Venezuela used to be, 30, 40 years ago, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America. On a per capita GDP, on average, it was a very wealthy country. Now, it wasn't exactly a capitalist country. It wasn't a free country. It was like most Latin American countries. It had a clear distinction between those who had and those who don't have. And that wasn't necessarily based on how productive you were, how innovative you were. It was based on the family you were born into and the political pull you could have. So I'm not advocating the system Venezuela had when it was the richest country in Latin America. It just, in spite of how bad it was, it's just better than the system they adopted later on. And one of the reasons they were so wealthy, well, two reasons. One is Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. Now, to be fair, it's very expensive to get the oil out of the ground in Venezuela because most of the oil is in the ocean and it's expensive and requires massive investment in technology to get the oil. In Saudi Arabia, you basically have to poke the ground and oil comes up. I mean, it's very easy to get the oil in Saudi Arabia. So Venezuela had a lot of oil and had a semi-free economy, and you had a lot of businessmen investing there. You had a lot of factories they were producing. And Venezuela has very fertile land. So you had farming that was producing a lot of food. They were actually exporters of food. You had a very productive farming sector. So generally, it was a relatively wealthy country, although it did hold people, the poor were held down as poor. And there was definitely this class system in Venezuela, again, like a lot of Latin America, almost feudalism, where some people controlled the economy because they had economic pull. So, and of course, the solution to that is more capitalism, more freedom, getting the government out of the business of allocating resources and benefiting some at the expense of others and letting the economy just flow. So if you're young and ambitious, you can rise up and become poor. The problem with feudal societies is they hold the young and ambitious down. So there were a number of steps that Venezuela took. Even before Hugo Chavez was elected, the government at some point nationalized the oil company, the oil fields. They reneged on contracts with U.S. producers and other producers. So they started doing bad things even before Chavez. And as a consequence of that, the economy was not doing well before Chavez was elected. Actually, Chavez was actually part of a coup. He was a colonel in the military. He tried to overtake the Venezuelan government. It was repressed. He ended up spending some time in jail. But he did it in the name of the people, and he did it in the name. And the military government actually cut a deal with, or the government, not the military government, the government cut a deal with him because they didn't want to alienate his supporters. They didn't really punish him. And he became this popular hero of the common man because he was fighting against this corrupt government that was holding back poor people. So he got elected president, and he got elected president basically on a very socialist platform, a very populist platform. And he got a lot of support from Cuba, and there was this trade going on between Cuba and Venezuela. Venezuela would send Cuba money that it would generate from the oil fields, and Cuba would send Venezuela intellectuals, doctors, and kind of military experts. So in the background, even today, there were a lot of Cubans in the background. The Cubans all over Venezuela, they're really the people pulling the strings. They're pulling the strings of Maduro. They're pulling the strings behind the military. They're the reason why this hasn't collapsed completely and Maduro's out and there's been a replacement in government. So Chavez and the Castros were very close. Chavez brought in these Cuban experts, and the things they did was they collectivized farming. So they did land reform. And I'm all for land reform in Latin America because, again, I think there are these distortions of the past. But I'm for privatizing the land and giving farmers ownership over their own land instead of letting, in a sense, their feudal lords own all the land. What Chavez did is he collectivized it. He created these collectives and gave them so-called ownership of the land. And he basically did massive land reform all over Venezuela, giving collectives these farms. Now, we've run this experiment before, right? Collective farming is an absolute unmitigated disaster. It led to somewhere between 20 to 30 million people dying of starvation in Ukraine in the 1930s. It led to something between 40 to 60 million people dying of starvation in China in the 1960s. And it led in Venezuela to the fact that they can't produce food, and they don't produce food. But it wasn't just the farming. He then landed up nationalizing almost the entire supply chain with regard to food. So all the different food manufacturers, all the different food suppliers, I mean, food is a whole supply chain from when the farmer all the way to grocery store. There's a lot of people in between. All of that, or a lot of that, was nationalized by Chavez. And as a consequence, and by the way, given a lot of the economic profits that were generated from that were given to the generals, and that's another way that he gets the army on his side, is that the military commanders in Venezuela are also the people benefiting the most from the economic system that exists today. They get the profits. Same exists in most authoritarian countries. You need the generals to be happy, so you give them a lot of money. Then he nationalized the entire supply chain around oil. So it's one thing just to nationalize the oil company and the oil fields, but now he nationalized all the supply chain, and again reneged on a bunch of contracts with Western companies. And and then any company that he deemed really, really important to the Venezuelan economy was nationalized, was taken over by the government. And as a consequence, the economy just started to decline and decline and decline. Now he was doing fine up until around the financial crisis. But you remember right after the financial crisis, oil prices plummeted. And it was when oil prices plummeted that suddenly the little oil they were getting, they weren't investing in technology. They weren't drilling new oil wells. So there was but the little oil they were getting, when it was at $120 a barrel, there was money. They could give to Cuba. They could bribe, in a sense, people with that money. But as soon as the oil price collapsed, suddenly the true nature of the Venezuelan economy was revealed for what it is. And that is, there's no production going on. They're not producing food. They're not producing anything of value. And most of the businessmen during the 2000s and the early teens have left Venezuela. Most of the talent has left Venezuela. The government invested nothing in the industries that it nationalized. The government invested nothing in electricity, the grid. 80% of all the electricity in Venezuela comes from one source, a hydroelectric plant on a big dam.
And this week, the entire country
is in the dark. It's been in the dark for what, 5-6 days now?
It hasn't gone back.
They don't have the skill set. The people, I mean, this is right out of, if you've ever read Atlas Shrugged, this is right out of Atlas Shrugged. The people with the skill set have gone because they're not going to stay in Venezuela. They've gone either to another Latin American country or they've come to the United States. They're talented people. The most productive people have all left. The people who know how to fix the electric grid have left. So they're stuck with a power outage. It's very difficult to bring particularly given the size of this, to bring it back up. The people who could actually do it are not there in the country anymore. They don't have the funds to bring experts from overseas, and a lot of countries are boycotting Venezuela anyway. It's an unmitigated disaster. Imagine what it's like to live for 5 days without electricity in the modern world in which we live. And on top of that, there's no food. There hasn't been food for years in Venezuela. People have eaten their dogs, eaten their cats. There are no pets in Venezuela. The zoos are completely empty because people have eaten the zoo animals. There's literally no food. And there's no basic things that we take for granted as basic. So not just the wealthy and the educated and the skilled have left, and now other people are leaving. So there's at least 1 million refugees in Colombia, not exactly a super rich country that can handle 1 million refugees. There's hundreds of thousands of refugees in Brazil, in the northern part of Brazil, the poor part of Brazil. Again, not exactly a country that can handle this number of refugees. And the entire society in Venezuela is basically collapsing. Now, in order to make people feel better about as all this collapse is happening, the government starts printing money. It starts handing people money because we think in terms of, if I've got a lot of money, I've got wealth. No, it's what the money can buy that matters. Right. But suddenly people discover there's nothing to buy, and the stuff that they want to buy, because everybody's got more money, goes up in prices faster than the money they have. So they had 1.5% million inflation last year, 1.5 million. It's hard to contemplate what that means. I have bills from Zimbabwe where the same thing happened. And again, Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It was a massive food exporter. And because of the same kind of economic policies, basically Zimbabweans were starving. They had millions of percent inflation. And I have these banknotes of 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars, 100 trillion. But Zimbabwe fixed it in the end, in a sense fixed it, by basically ending their currency. So there is no Zimbabwe currency.
You said they dollarized?
They didn't dollarize. They basically stopped using their own currency because it was worth
Nothing.
nothing. So it was easier to use it as wallpaper than it was to actually buy stuff.
Right.
So what they use in Zimbabwe, have been using, is South African rand, US dollars, euros. They'll use other currencies. They just won't use.
So they don't even have a currency.
No. So the central bank basically shut down. So there's no currency, which is great for Zimbabwe because they were doing such an awful job. They still have bad policies with regard to farming and with regard to these other things. And as a consequence, the Zimbabwe economy is not doing great, but it's doing better because at least the inflation is out. Venezuela would have to do the same thing. They would have to either convert to a new currency and eliminate the existing currency, or just eliminate all currency and do like Ecuador, go on the dollar or something like that. But the problem in Venezuela, I mean, this is the deeper problem, and this relates to a lot of what's going on in the world. The problem in Venezuela is that the opposition is not that much better. So this guy who is claiming to be president and who is
Nicolas
opposing,
Maduro?
No, Maduro is the president, right? There's the opposition guy who's announced that he is president now, and that's the kind of the internal fight. He's the head of the equivalent of the House of Representatives in the United States. And he declared the previous election as fraudulent, and therefore he constitutionally becomes president. He's a socialist too. So
is it wrong?
nobody's challenging socialism. And in a day when Venezuela is doing what it's doing because of socialism, collectivizing farms, nationalizing businesses, classic socialism. In America, socialism has never been more popular. So socialism's on the rise everywhere, including in some countries in Latin America, in spite of Venezuela. Capitalism's on the decline in terms of popularity, even though everybody can see right before their eyes the consequence of socialism. And everybody should be able to see, or if they know a little bit of history, if they know something about the world, the outcome of capitalism. And yet everybody chooses socialism instead of capitalism. They choose poverty, starvation, and eating their pets over, the kind of world that is possible of great prosperity, great, life expectancy, great quality of life, great standard of living. They don't want that, it turns out.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.